everyone, and welcome back to Scum Villain's Self-Saving System. Hello, Jeff, Daniel, Kohi, Lobsoul, welcome. Let's see, last week we had finished Chapter 37, the Labyrinthine Water Prison Part 1. We're in the middle of Shen Qingqiu, our hero, being wrongly accused of crimes that he maybe probably didn't commit. If they were committed, it was his past self, or he didn't commit them, and he's being framed. And obviously, he thinks it's Luo Binghe, who is his former student that he was forced to betray and is now returned from the abyss earlier than expected, and has shown up just as this plot is unfolding. And so Shen Qingqiu is thinking, it's gotta be him getting his revenge. Well, sure enough, he is in the prison, the water prison right now. Luo Binghe shows up and is upset when Shen Qingqiu accuses him of being involved, is surprised almost. And now we are right there at that moment where the two of them are talking about their feelings, kind of, and are going to get bad things gonna happen. Hello, Phoenix, Robin, Delvin, welcome. Let's hop right into it. Chapter 38, The Labyrinthine Water Prison, Part 2. This Jinlan City plotline was newly appended. Going by the original timeline, Luo Binghe should have been training underground right now, and never appeared at all, so Shen Qingqiu didn't have the advantage of an omniscient point of view. But airplanes shooting towards the sky had guaranteed one thing. After Luo Binghe completed his training and returned to the surface, every scheme and slaughter had something to do with him. However you thought about it, the most suspicious one was him. Luo Binghe's expression was sullen. He paced a few circles back and forth, his hands behind his back, then suddenly turned around and said in a severe tone, "I dare ask, Shizun, are you going to blame every last one of the demon race's sins, their murdering and marauding, their crimes and evil deeds on me?" Shen Qingqiu furrowed his brow. Seeing his lack of answer, Luo Binghe slowly clenched his fist and continued, "Before, you clearly used to trust me so much, but now you suspect me of harboring ulterior motives at every turn. Is the difference between realm and race so important that it could make your attitude towards someone change so completely?" Shen Qingqiu was really unable to hold back. He gathered up his courage and said, "If so, I also have a question for you." Luo Binghe tilted his head and said, "This disciple is listening." Shen Qingqiu said, "What is the reason for turning Huanhua Palace to your side if you deny harboring ulterior motives? Why hadn't the male lead followed the original plot? After suffering the system and the plot constraints himself, he had to ask this question." Hearing this, Luo Binghe started and moved his lips as if he was about to speak, but in the end he hesitated to open his mouth. Shen Qingqiu was a bit surprised. "You can't answer. Where was the silver tongue capable of taking on the entire Kangchong Mountain with eloquence alone? Could this be the price of going through the Endless Abyss side plot too quickly and not training and leveling up properly? He hadn't leveled his speech skill enough." Luo Binghe said, "Shh, hello, you can't hang out in here right now."
Sorry, I wanted to give this to you.
Okay, you can set it down. Thank you. Addie says hi. Hearing this, Luo Binghe started and moved his lips as if he... Oh, no, we read that. Luo Binghe said, "Shizun wouldn't believe me either way. Whether I answer or not, what's the difference?" Qing is closer to Qin Cho, so the last syllable is more like a O than a U. Okay, Qing Cho. Shen Qingqiu. Okay. Whether I answer or not, what's the difference? In the gloomy water prison, the water reflected the trembling firelight. Shen Qingqiu's heart seemed to tremble along with it. After facing each other in silence for a while, Luo Binghe suddenly said, "But I hope Shizun can give me an honest answer to one question." Pursing his lips, he stiffly added, "One question." Shen Qingqiu said, "Speak." Luo Binghe sucked in a light breath. He said quietly, "Do you regret it?" Shen Qingqiu closed his mouth and did not reply. His eyes moved, looking Luo Binghe up and down from head to toe. This, do you regret it, was all he said, nothing more. He must be asking if he regretted kicking Luo Binghe into the endless abyss. Nonsense. Of course, he regretted it. His intestines had gone green with regret. But what did Luo Binghe mean by asking this question? Shen Qingqiu's temples were twitching, when suddenly a giant window popped up before him. Please look at the choices. Choice A. Yes, this master has regretted it since long ago. These past few years there wasn't a moment I did not spend in remorse, though it was far too late. Choice B. A cold laugh. After seeing what you're like today, I know there was no need to regret. Or choice C. Maintain silence. Damn it. You upgraded and this thing was the fucking upgrade? What is with those parentheses? You've even set the tone and expression for me. Do you think we're playing a dating sim? This was worse than the original low-tech version. Quickly, who can give me System 1.0 installation package? I'll thank their entire family. Shen Qingqiu's face filled with black lines. A is way too fake. If I was Luo Binghe, not only wouldn't I believe it, I'd be disgusted. What the hell is B? Do you wish he'd snapped my neck last time? System, please make a suggestion. Selection. Jeez, I can't read today. Candy's back. Hello, Mr. Cross. Tintin, welcome. Shen Qingqiu picked C. System, character depth level plus 10. Shen Qingqiu, can't you tell me how character depth is calculated? So he gazed fixedly ahead and kept his silence. Unable to get an answer, Luo Binghe's tightly clenched fist slowly loosened, and he laughed at himself. I knew the answer, but I still asked Shizun the question. I'm so stupid. If he hadn't known Luo Binghe was the power source of all the systems in the world, Shen Qingqiu would have suspected he'd been replaced by an imposter. If he hadn't had an omniscient POV understanding of the plot, Shen Qingqiu would have actually suspected Luo Binghe was just a bit sad. Silence was golden. More words meant more mistakes. Shen Qingqiu closed his eyes and sat silently, his legs crossed. Facing this spell of silence, Luo Binghe spoke in a light and cold voice. Shizun, you were always a man of few words. Before, you were still willing to say a few words to me, but now you won't even do that. After a pause, his tone suddenly changed and he sneered. But it doesn't matter. I have plenty of ways to make you talk. As he finished his last word, Shen Qingqiu's eyes flew open. A dense spat of stabbing pains came from his abdomen. Speaking makes you unhappy. Refusing to speak makes you unhappy. What crime did I commit? After a moment, the stabbing pain disappeared, and what replaced it was the strange sensation of something crawling inside his blood vessels. The heavenly demon blood had been in hibernation for many days, and had already completely adapted to the environment inside the host's body. Impelled by its master, it had coalesced into insects, beginning to explore the host body's organs. Luo Binghe said leisurely, spleen, kidneys, heart, lungs. As he listed each location, an extremely bizarre itching pain would come from that location. It was truly both an itch and a pain, like rows on rows of tiny teeth densely biting down. It even came with a burning sensation. Though it was not a piercing pain, it was still awful to suffer through. Shen Qingqiu couldn't stay sitting up any longer and folded over at the waist, resisting the urge to curl up into a ball. Cold sweat dripped down together with the beads of water still on his chin. This finally seemed like Luo Binghe's style, but unfortunately it was turned on him. Fuck, his stomach hurts so much. Is this what it feels like when you get your period? Luo Binghe said warmly, Shizun, where do you want them to start biting? Nowhere! They haven't even started biting yet? What will it feel like when they do? Shen Qingqiu slapped the system window. Think of something, okay? I'm still your customer, right? System. Use key prop fake jade guanin. Please note the prop may only be used once. Shen Qingqiu. What's Luo Binghe's current anger level? System. 30 points. Shen Qingqiu said, "Why is it so low? Are you sure you didn't calculate wrong? It's completely unscientific. To use a mystic device that would eliminate 5,000 anger points on a 30-point problem? Absolutely not." Shen Qingqiu said, "Are there any other options? What's the second highest rated method in the field?" "Activate small scenario pusher?" Listening to the name, it didn't sound very high-tech, but if this was the second highest rated method in the field, it would do. Shen Qingqiu selected it decisively. Oh boy. Oh my goodness, has music not been playing? I wonder if it's set to not repeat. Sorry about that, music's back on. Listening to the name, it didn't sound very high-tech, but if this was the second highest rated method in the field, it would do. Shen Qingqiu selected it decisively. Luo Binghe sneered. "You don't want to look at me. You don't want to talk to me. Do you think I'm filthy?" As he spoke, he suddenly took a step forward and humphed. "If so, I absolutely won't allow you to succeed." He reached out to grab Shen Qingqiu's shoulder. Seeing his move, Shen Qingqiu subconsciously dodged. Luo Binghe caught nothing but a corner of his clothing. The outer robe had already been ripped to shreds by the little palace mistress's whip, and with the tug, over half of it tore straight off his shoulder. Neither of them could have expected this development. Both of them were frozen on the spot, petrified. Shen Qingqiu had had a basin of cold water dumped all over him. Even now, his clothes and hair were sticking wetly to fair skin, while strands and strands of immortal binding cables, as thin as red threads, were wound around his body. Even if the expression on his face, being shock, couldn't be any more proper, his whole person looked extremely improper. Luo Binghe's eyes instantly opened wide. After staring for a while, he suddenly reacted like he'd been scalded by an iron, immediately whipping his hand away and spinning around. With this step back of his, the blood, which had been stirring in his internal organs, seemed to have been startled as well, scattering like birds and beasts. The sense of blockage in his blood vessels instantly disappeared. Shen Qingqiu panted, his heart flooding his tears. His period's finally over. I love it. Hey, Liz. Thanks for joining us. So, exactly how did this small scenario pusher work? By making him lose some of his clothes? Might as well call it small stripping assistant. What was the logic behind the operation? To take advantage of Luo Binghe's physiological disgust upon seeing a man's half-naked body? Luo Binghe stood stiffly with his back turned for a while, like he didn't know where to put his limbs. Suddenly, he tugged off his outer robe at top speed and tossed it behind him. The outer robe hit Shen Qingqiu full in the face. What's the meaning of this? The scene, these actions, why did they nonsensically make him uneasy all over? He couldn't help but get reminded of the classic bad trope where, after the young maiden who'd been violated was rescued, the boyfriend drapes a warm coat over her. Shen Qingqiu's hair stood on end. He lifted his arm, letting the black outer robe slide down from his shoulders. The soft and fine fabric dropped to the ground, silver light shimmering along the fine, sleek embroidery patterns. Hearing the rustling sounds, Luo Binghe turned back to look and saw his outer robe abandoned on the ground. Shen Qingqiu had even cautiously pushed it towards him a bit. Shen Qingqiu had actually even considered folding it for Luo Binghe, but he was only considering and hadn't yet made a move. When he looked up, Luo Binghe had already turned around, and from his eyes came the blinding reflection of firelight. It seemed like he was in a fury. The veins on the backs of his hands popped, his fingers clenching and unclenching several times. Then, as if he was trying to vent his rage, he fired off a couple of spiritual blasts. Hey, Katsuki, welcome! Seems strangely familiar during the Skinner finale. It does. There are a few times I think that this happens where his nakedness is a plot point. Specifically this time, soaking wet, half naked, red cords wrapped around him, like very obviously kind of a sexual reference there. And he's like, Binghe is so disgusted by my body. No, he's not. This was actually him firing off a series of attacks with no target at all. A few hit the surface of the lake, striking a wave of water high into the air. Another hit the wall of the cave, opening a giant hole. Pieces of stone rolled down, and the torches shook and fell into the lake, yet they weren't extinguished, and instead continued to burn brightly on the water's surface. the light casting onto Luo Binghe's face and causing it to flicker between light and shadow, creating a ghostly atmosphere. He slowly drew back and said, "I almost forgot. Shizun dislikes anything the demon race has touched." The honorable male lead was actually ignoring his image to throw a tantrum for no reason. What difference was there from a little child kicking their toys all over the place when they didn't get their way? Cutting your own points, really. It's so obvious. He does not understand at all. He's so smart. How has he not picked up on the fact that Binghe is trying to help him and feels like his teacher is spitting in his face because he's a demon? Just talk to him! Ugh. Of course, the system did get in the way that one time, but it doesn't keep him from talking about anything else. He just couldn't answer the one question. Say something! A perfectly good cave ended up with walls full of holes before Luo Binghe had finally finished raging. He turned, and Shen Qingqiu was still just observing, unperturbed. A vein seemed to jump a few times in Luo Binghe's temple, and he forced out through gritted teeth. Sorry, that came out of nowhere. Apparently Luo Binghe sneezed. No. In a month, I want to watch just how you will fall from grace. After throwing down those words, he swept his sleeves and walked away, slamming a hand down onto the mechanism as he exited the wave. With a rumble, the water curtain poured back down. Shen Qingqiu sat in place, staring upwards in bewilderment. He'd already become a prisoner for him to do with as he pleased, so why was he so angry? Yeah, Shen Qingqiu's not wrong to be terrified, and I think this is, you know, the story is a comedy, so they heighten up the humoristic part, you know, the humor and the jokes, but I think he really is just so afraid out of his mind he's not seeing things clearly. That is what's going on. Because otherwise, how can you not see? He literally says, "Oh, so you hate me, so I'm a demon." All he'd have to say is, "No." "No, I'm scared because you have parasites inside me." Anyway. Alright. Let me see if my music is set up appropriately. Ba-ba-ba. Are you right? Yes. Loop? Yes. Let's see. Are you right? Okay, there we go. Hopefully it will work now. Chapter 39. Escape from the Water Prison. The inside of the cave was dark and gloomy. When the freezing wind blew, his wet clothes stuck to his skin, freezing him until Shen Qingqiu gave a firm shiver. To one side, Luo Binghe's outer robe still lay tossed on the ground. Shen Qingqiu's mind couldn't help but wander off. When Luo Binghe had been training at Qingjing Peak, forget about his mood swings now. He'd never even randomly thrown tantrums, but the way he'd looked while shaking out his sleeves and storming off unexpectedly made Shen Qingqiu see a tiny shadow of the little sheep from the past. Coming back from his thoughts, his entire body was racked with cold, and he wanted to sneeze. With no other option, Shen Qingqiu's fingertips gingerly closed over that black outer robe and hesitantly draped it over himself. It couldn't be helped. Just then, if it hadn't been him being tsundere, but that he simply couldn't make himself do this in front of Luo Binghe. In the original work, didn't Luo Binghe give the girl this exact robe every time after having sex? How could he, right in front of the protagonist? Shen Qingqiu discovered that every time he tried to meditate or clear his mind, there would always be some form of outside disruption. For example, at Lingxi Cave then, and now again in the water prison. Are we gonna watch more of the anime and finish Untamed? We will, yeah. We've just had other stuff going on, unfortunately. Maybe this Wednesday we'll be able to do it. The stone path rose and the water curtain stopped flowing. Gong Yishao hurried across the path. With only a glance at Shen Qingqiu, his feet slipped out from under him. He stammered, Senior Shen, you... Shen Qingqiu didn't think anything was strange. What about me? Gong Yishao had a strange look on his face, like he didn't know whether or not he should turn around and retreat. He hesitated outside the stone platform without continuing on. I just read what y'all are saying. This story is a comedy. A few chapters before a certain thing happens. Well, It's definitely intended as comedic. Like, it plays a lot, it plays in funny ways with a lot of tropes and ideas, but it also really breaks your heart, too. Gong Yishao said hesitantly, "That robe, isn't it?" Shen Qingqiu sighed. Luo Binghe's outer robe. Gong Yishao finally reacted. He quickly coughed, then asked, "How has Senior Shen been these past 2 days?" I am going to murder every human. I will be right back. Oh, jeez. Oh. Kitty left anyway, so. Ugh. Aw, there you are, over there. Oh, well. Maybe he'll come back. Where were we? Oh wait, here we go. Gong Yishao finally reacted, and he said blah blah blah. Shen Qingqiu replied, "Satisfactory. If he wasn't so popular, he'd be even better. Within the span of 2 days, 3 people had already visited. This luxury VIP single room he was temporarily detained in must have been a super popular item since Huanhua Palace's establishment." Gong Yishao said, "I heard last night, Luo Shishong, he was in a terrible rage when he left. This junior was worried he might have done something to Senior Shen." As he spoke, his eyes involuntarily drifted to that black outer robe. Under his stare, Shen Qingqiu couldn't help but pull the robe tighter over his chest. Done what? Luo Binghe had only thrown a tantrum and punched holes all over the place, collapsing half the cave. What's with that look in your eyes? Shen Qingqiu sighed. Luo Binghe is really like a fish back in water at Huanhua Palace. Gong Yishao smiled bitterly and said, "Not only that, Luo Shishong's spiritual power is outstanding. His conduct is unwavering, and his actions swift and decisive. Other people are left in the dust. So it's no wonder Shizun regards him so highly. If he weren't so insistent on not taking him as his master, I'm afraid I would never have had a chance of becoming head disciple." Seeing the look on his face, Shen Qingqiu could sincerely sympathize. Gong Yishao said resolutely, "This junior came to see you about an important matter. This morning, Peak Lord Shang requested an authorization pass from my master, but his application was delayed and he doesn't know when he can get through. He seemed like he had some pressing business and asked this junior to bring in a letter." As he spoke, he reached into his lapel. Fuck, it really was a letter. It was only hastily folded twice, without even a wax seal or a sealing spell. Shang Qinghua, how daring! Gong Yishao said, "Please relax, senior. I've already looked through the letter." "Then relax my ass!" Gong Yishao continued. "However, I couldn't understand what it was saying." Shen Qingqiu internally let out a sigh of relief. Whew, good. It looked like he'd misunderstood. Shang Qinghua wouldn't fuck up this badly. Most likely he'd used a secret code in the letter, so there was nothing to fear even if someone had intercepted it. Shen Qingqiu shook open the paper with 2 fingers. After skimming it, his face turned green. After reading 2 lines, his face turned white. All sorts of colors intertwined and bloomed on his face in a lively display. The letter was written in English. Not only that, it was written in error-ridden Chinglish. The grammar was entirely Chinese, and any word he didn't know was replaced by its pinyin equivalent. Great Master Airplane shooting towards the sky, did you not consider, what if I can't understand your toilet English? After puzzling his way through the general gist of the thing, Shen Qingqiu directed some energy to his hand. The paper broke into fragments and fell to the floor like June snow, exactly like his currently tumultuous mental state. As it turns out, it was he who had underestimated Great Master Airplane shooting towards the sky. For Peerless Cucumber's eyes only. Everything is set, the preparations are ready. The place has not changed. Just there was a small mishap with the time. In order to have the sun and moon dew mushroom mature as soon as possible, I fixed up a little something to promote its maturation, but I accidentally overdid it. Right now it's as mature as it will ever get, and will rot in no more than a week. So, I hope you can leave Huanhua Palace's water prison as soon as possible. Don't worry, it was only something like chemical fertilizer, so there shouldn't be any difference when using the mushroom. Probably. This wasn't just being unreliable. Did the concept of reliable even exist in this guy's life? What does toilet English mean? I guess it's so, a combination of Chinese and English that's so hard to understand because he only half knows English. I would be curious to see that letter. He'd used chemical fertilizer to ripen the all-natural, unpolluted life form. Fertilizer! There shouldn't be any difference when using. This sort of guarantee was about as trustworthy as the ones from producers of that big-headed powder infant formula, which apparently, refers to several infamous incidents involving shoddy powdered infant formula from 2003 to 2005 in China. The infant weight would rapidly drop while their heads became strangely shaped, so they were known as big head babies. Oh no, that's horrible. Big head babies. That's terrible. Gong Yishao looked around and said, "Senior, are you done reading? If you have, please toss the letter into the lake to destroy it. In fact, last night, Luo Shishang commanded that no one but him was allowed to enter. I must leave as early as possible in order to avoid being discovered and causing more complications." Shen Qingqiu grabbed Gong Yishao and said, "Do me a favor." Gong Yishao responded, "Go ahead and ask, as long as I..." Shen Qingqiu didn't wait for him to finish saying, "am able," and sincerely asked, "Let me out." Gong Yishao said with difficulty, "Senior, I really can't do that." Shen Qingqiu said solemnly, "I have a reason to insist on leaving. It absolutely isn't because I want to flee the trial. After finishing my affairs, I will return to the water prison myself to await judgment. If you don't believe me, we could establish a blood oath." One could not renege on a blood oath. But in truth, after completing his affairs, it wouldn't matter whether Shen Qingqiu returned to Huanhua Palace's water prison, so he was being dishonorable. Gong Yishao said awkwardly, "I certainly believe, Senior, but wasn't being detained in the water prison primarily your request? Exactly what is so critical you absolutely have to leave? If you are willing to explain, I can report to the sect leaders and seniors participating in the investigation." Shen Qingqiu had some second thoughts. Gong Yishao was a Huanhua Palace disciple, and being involved in the escape of a prisoner was no small sin, no matter whose head it was on. This was an upstanding youngster. Throwing him to the wolves was rather unkind. Within the 7-day limit, there were bound to be other opportunities. Therefore, he changed his tone and said, "Forget it. It wasn't anything serious." As he spoke, he reluctantly collected all the paper fragments on the ground before tossing them into the lake to destroy the evidence. Because most of his body was bound by immortal binding cables, movement was extremely difficult. After shifting a couple times, the black robe slid off his body. Gong Yishao had originally bent down to help, but seeing the black robe cast aside on the ground, he unintentionally looked up. His arms and legs went rigid at the sight. The white garment on his body had been ripped clean from the shoulder. It was obvious from a glance someone had violently torn it apart with their bare hands. In addition, there were fragments of fabric left hanging that looked like they'd been shredded by a whip. On the fair skin exposed by the damage, there were more than a few pale red scrapes. When looking closely, there were also faint traces on his neck that had yet to fade. Gong Yishao's worldview received a devastating shock. He said in a trembling voice, "Senior, are you sure you're all right?" No wonder Luo Binghe had ordered no one but him was allowed to enter, even if they had the authorization pass, and even confiscated Peak Lord Shang's application. So it's like this. An insubordinate disciple, devoid of conscience, worse than a beast. Gong Yizhao inwardly cried tears of blood for Senior Shen. Shen Qingqiu himself said blankly, "I'm all right, yes." Gong Yishao was shaken. How can Senior Shen show this kind of tranquil expression even in this kind of moment? Shen Qingqiu finished tossing all the paper fragments into the lake and said, "You don't need to take the words I just said now to heart. Gong Yishao suddenly stood up, turned around, and left. Shen Qingqiu's face filled with black lines. "I said you didn't need to take it to heart and you just leave immediately? Isn't that a little too blunt?" But before an hour had passed, Gongyi Xiao returned again, holding an object in his hands. He walked over to Shen Qingqiu, unwrapped the seals binding it, and slashed downwards. With a white flash, the bindings around Shen Qingqiu's body abruptly loosened, and it felt like an electric current had suddenly been reconnected. He stretched his fingers. His spiritual energy was unmistakably back in operation and flowing smoothly. Last time it had been blocked by Without a Cure randomly activating, but after being bound by the immortal binding cables for 2 days, the poison had unexpectedly been suppressed again. Could it have been the same kind of principle as fighting fire with fire, or 2 negatives make a positive? The immortal binding cables fell to the ground, overwhelmed and astonished. Looking over at Gongyi Xiao, he said, "I thought this was supposed to be with the old palace master." Gongyi Xiao said righteously, "Even if I risk being punished by my master, I cannot sit back and remain aloof while you are disgraced. I trust you, Senior Shen. Please follow me." Shen Qingqiu involuntarily felt a sense of helplessness. What's that? I feel like he seems to have misunderstood something very important. But forget it. This is fine. Shen Qingqiu said decisively, "Good." So, what has happened? He has misunderstood, thinks that from the whips and the torn clothing that he is being abused by his student, possibly in a romantic nature because of the torn clothing, and he thinks he's been dishonored. So for that reason, he's willing to break the rules and save him. I mean, it works for Shen Qingqiu's goals, but that's not what's happening. This whole story, this whole portion is just misunderstanding after misunderstanding. It is a comedy of errors that ends up not having a punchline that's very funny. Okay, let me grab this real quick. And Kitty's come join us again, so I'll put this kind of down where we can kind of see Kitty. He's taking a nap in front of the heater. Though the heavenly demon blood in his body was still dormant, no matter where he ran, Luo Binghe would always be able to know where he was. However, knowing where he was didn't matter, as long as Luo Binghe couldn't chase him there. Gongyi Xiao said, deeply worried, "Senior, can you walk? Do you need me to carry?" With a dark expression, Shen Qingqiu took a large stride, marching forwards, using the action to prove that he could walk, and very quickly at that. Gongyi Xiao startled, then promptly followed close behind. Unexpectedly, when the two stepped outside the area of the stone platform and onto the path, the water curtain that had already been raised before gave a rumble, and water gushed forth. Shen Qingqiu, who'd been running quickly, also braced quickly lest he be sprayed head-on, and the two stepped back onto the stone platform, and the water curtain gradually stopped. This was basically it deliberately stopping them from leaving. Isn't this design a bit too intelligent? Gongyi Xiao suddenly understood. I forgot. Once the water prison has been activated, there must be someone on the stone platform. If a person leaves and there isn't enough weight on the platform, the water curtain will automatically reactivate, even if the mechanism has shut it off. In the past, he'd never helped a prisoner escape. Naturally, he hadn't remembered this sort of thing. Shen Qingqiu said, "In other words, there has to be one person left on the platform before the others can leave." Gongyi Xiao nodded. Shen Qingqiu said, "Then you stay here." Gongyi Xiao looked at him. After saying this, he shook out his sleeves and headed towards the outside. Behind him, Gongyi Xiao weakly raised his hand and said, "Senior Shen, even though I am very willing to serve, but, if you don't have me to lead the way, I'm afraid you won't be able to get out, huh?" Shen Qingqiu looked back and added, "Wait for me to come back." Gongyi Xiao looked stupefied in place. He had a mind to follow, but was hindered by having no way to leave the stone platform, so he could only stay and wait. In a short amount of time, he heard a muffled sound from outside, and Shen Qingqiu walked in, carrying a person by the back of the neck. Shen Qingqiu dragged the still unconscious, pock-faced disciple onto the stone platform, patted Gongyi Xiao on the shoulder, and said, "I happened to see this one on patrol and borrowed him for a bit. Let's go." In reality, he didn't just happen to see him. There were 4 people on patrol. Shen Qingqiu had secretly concealed himself, and only after careful selection had he grabbed this mouthy disciple. Revenge! Hee hee. Gong Yi's Cedric? Is that Cedric? What is that a reference to? Oh man. Chapter 40, Fleeing Death in Huayue. Just then, Gong Yi Zhao had also thought about grabbing a random disciple to use as a weight, but the idea had only indistinctly flashed by. Now that Shen Qingqiu had already done it himself, that meant there was no need for him to personally knock out a fellow disciple. He couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. As the two of them headed towards the outside, shoulder to shoulder, he saw Shen Qingqiu draw that black robe draped around his shoulders tighter, and a lump came to his throat. He couldn't help but feel agonized. For Shen Qingqiu, who was the leader of a peak, to be imprisoned and humiliated was already something he was reluctant about. Yet now Shen Qingqiu still needed to depend on a piece of clothing from his humiliator to cover his body and conceal his humiliation. How could he not sigh and lament? His Cedric is his fandom nickname because he's such a Hufflepuff. Okay, that definitely makes... I wondered if that's what you were going for. Yeah, that makes sense. He is very much. Shen Qingqiu saw his expression flicker. It looked like sympathy, but also indignation. He could only face the myriad of expressions by remaining expressionless. Suddenly, Gong Yi Zhao said, "Senior, please, take it off!" Shen Qingqiu... We said Cho. Huh? Without waiting for him to recover, Gong Yi Zhao had already begun taking off his own outer robe. Shen Qingqiu was just considering if he should toss a spiritual blast at him to try and return him to his senses, when Gong Yi Zhao was already offering the outer robe he'd removed with both hands, saying, "Please wear this." Shen Qingqiu suddenly understood. Oh, this was what he meant. Luo Binghe's clothes may have been black, but the clothes matched the person. The male lead himself was very sophisticated, luxurious yet understated, so Gong Yi Zhao disapproved of how wearing them would attract attention. Changing into a white robe that was more likely to be worn by others would be more advantageous to their chances of escape, right? Such attentiveness. Yeah, sure, yep, that's definitely what he's doing. Hello, Voldzak, thanks for joining us. He decisively removed Luo Binghe's robe and changed into Gong Yi Zhao's. Before leaving, he thought for a while, then still went to fold Luo Binghe's clothes. Only after this did he place it on the ground. Upon leaving the water prison, in the beginning navigation didn't feel particularly difficult, but the further they walked, the more he felt that Huanhua Palace's maze array was indeed very terrifying. It was cave after cave, path intersecting with path. Every couple of steps, they'd circled around and around to the point it made one's head spin. Despite Gong Yi Zhao's back being close in front, he almost lost him quite a few times. If it hadn't been for Gong Yi Zhao knowing the assignments and schedules of water prison staff like the back of his hand, who knows how many patrolling disciple guards they would have run into. After an hour, the two of them finally made it out of the underground water prison. They walked many kilometers without stopping and entered Bailu Forest, about to leave Huanhua Palace's territory border. The water prison's alarm had yet to sound, meaning that up to now no one had discovered the prisoner was gone. Luo Binghe's order forbidding all others from visiting the water prison had instead become a great help to Shen Qingqiu's escape. After a short while, Shen Qingqiu said, "Young Master Gong Yi, after this point you needn't stay to stand me off. Hurry back now while we're still undetected." After a pause, he added, "Within 7 days, go to Huayue City. You'll definitely find me there." Gong Yi Zhao said, "If that's the case, I won't accompany you any further. Even though I don't know how Senior intends to deal with future matters, please be careful. And Senior, please don't worry about the trial by forceps in a month. It's as you said. Those clean will remain clean no matter what. The sect leaders will definitely exonerate you." Unable to help himself, Shen Qingqiu laughed. First, his dark history was final and couldn't be cleansed. Second, the trial next month had fuck all to do with him. He immediately cupped his hands, carefree and satisfied. May we meet again. The road from Huanhua Palace's border to Huayue City went through the most densely populated, most economically developed area of the Central Plains, which also meant that within this area was concentrated a very large number of secular cultivation sects and influential families. The cultivators of this world valued aerial defense highly. Like in Jinlan City, they would often set up aerial defense barriers over their territories. If an immortal sword or spiritual device flew through above the speed limit, it would be undoubtedly discovered and reported to the sects higher up. Obviously, it would be like bombastically broadcasting his path of escape with a megaphone. Shen Qingqiu flew part of the way and walked another part of the way without rest until he finally arrived at Huayue City the following night. His arrival timing was extremely unfortunate. A festival celebrating the establishment of Huayue City was happening at the time. The city would be brightly lit the entire night and was adorned with colored lanterns. Soaring dragons and lion dances filled the streets, the drums and music thunderous. People were packed together. On his arrival, dark clouds covered the moon. Without the support of sun or moonlight, the chance of failure would greatly increase. Anxious about the odds, Shen Qingqiu decided to wait for the time being, at most one day. If after one day the clouds were yet to disperse, he couldn't afford to care anymore. If the chance of failure would be greater, let it. It would still be better than clinging to an overripe sun, moon, dew mushroom and crying. At that point, even if it was cooked and served with alcohol, it would reek of fertilizer. As Shen Qingqiu walked slowly, he'd occasionally bump into rowdy children or brush past groups of laughing girls. He had a slight feeling that it was a pity. If he weren't currently fleeing, he would have been able to take a thorough tour of the city. Suddenly, walking towards him were several men, long swords slung over their backs, all dressed in clothes of the same color. Each one had his head high and chest out. From a glance, one could tell they were arrogant disciples from a miscellaneous sect. Though it sounds strange, the smaller and more miscellaneous the sect, the more afraid their disciples would be that others didn't know they were cultivators. If only they could embroider huge slogans on their clothes. Shen Qingqiu turned his body in a natural manner and smoothly picked up a demon mask from the side. He placed it over his face, then openly and confidently walked towards them. At the festival, 6 out of 10 of the goers were wearing masks. Mixing into them, he wasn't afraid of drawing attention. He heard one man from the group say, "Shishong, is that Shu Ya sword really sitting around waiting for others to capture him?" The leader berated, "The 4 sects sent out warrants for capture together. How could it be fake? Didn't you see how many sects have sent people here to surround him? Watch carefully. You saw Huanhua Palace's reward money. Don't you want it?" A myriad of thoughts filled Shen Qingqiu's mind. Turns out that without his knowledge, he'd also become a wanted criminal. It's no wonder Huanhua Palace put down such a large sum. What happened to them was really too terrible. Shen Qingqiu thought, the most I did was knock out an insignificant disciple from Huanhua Palace. I didn't do anything else. So how did Huanhua Palace become such a miserable victim? He wanted to keep listening, but they pulled further and further ahead, the rush of people cutting him off, so he could only give up. While he was mulling over whether he should find an abandoned inn to rest, he suddenly felt a weight upon his leg. Looking down, he saw a small child clinging to his thigh. The child slowly raised his head. His face was pallid, like he was malnourished, but his eyes were both large and bright, staring straight at him. He clung to his thigh, unwilling to let go. Shen Qingqiu patted his head. "Who's your family? Did you get lost?" The small child nodded. When he spoke, his voice was soft and sweet. "I got lost." Seeing that his appearance was naturally endearing and even seemed a little familiar, Shen Qingqiu leaned over and picked him up, letting him sit on his arm. "Who brought you here?" The child clung to his neck and pursed his lips. "With Shizun." Could it be some sect's young disciple? That in the case a grown-up came to look for him, that would really be a headache. But for some reason, the forlorn way this child called Shizun especially stirred Shen Qingqiu's pity. He couldn't harden his heart and toss him onto the side of the road, leaving him to continue huddling pitifully. He patted his soft behind and said, "Shizun didn't look after you properly. How incredibly awful of him. Where did you get lost? Do you remember?" The child giggled into his ear and said, "I remember. Shizun personally threw me down himself. How could I not remember?" Half of Shen Qingqiu's body immediately went cold. He felt what he was holding in his arms wasn't the body of a young child, but a poisonous snake. A massive snake that was wound around his neck and baring its fangs, about to bite and inject venom at any moment. He abruptly threw the person in his arms away and turned around, his back covered in goosebumps. In an instant, the fine hairs all over his body stood straight up. The entire street was looking at him. The ones wearing masks, the ones not wearing masks. In a moment, it was like they were all frozen, holding their breaths and watching him. For the ones wearing masks, their sinister and demonic visages were frightening, but the ones not wearing masks were even more panic-inducing. They didn't have faces. Shen Qingqiu's instinct in that instant was to place his hand on Shu Ya, but he quickly caught himself. He couldn't attack. This was what he'd taught Luo Binghe back then. While within Meng Mo's barrier, attacking people appearing in the dream realm would be attacking his own spirit. From Shen Qingqiu's forehead dripped cold sweat. He had actually completely failed to realize when he'd entered the barrier, though people never remembered when and how exactly a dream began. But he'd been fleeing. It couldn't be he was dull-witted enough to fall asleep on the side of the road while running. From behind him came a tender voice. "Shizun." Just then, when the voice had been heard by his ear, it had sounded clearly and utterly adorable and tender. But now, listening to it, there was actually something unspeakably terrifying about it. A child, Luo Binghe, stood behind him, smiling faintly. "Why don't you want me anymore?" Shen Qingqiu decisively refused to turn his head and immediately took off. Though he'd said that these faceless people were all watching him, no, you couldn't say watching because they didn't have eyes. Their faces were all turned in Shen Qingqiu's direction, and he could indeed feel the weight of countless gazes on him. Shen Qingqiu pretended he couldn't see any of this and charged straight ahead, thrusting aside anyone who was in his way. Suddenly a hand intercepted his palm. He turned his head to look. Though this hand was slim, its strength was terrifying, basically like an iron hoop. A 14-year-old Luo Binghe firmly gripped his wrist. On his face was not only the bruising that had been there for years on end, but overflowing melancholy. Those pitch-black eyes stared right at him, almost within reach. "Ah, you're still coming." Shen Qingqiu tried 3 times before he finally flung him off, then pushed aside the crowd and continued to run. First was a child, second was a youth. If next came an adult version, he really wouldn't be able to take it. But the street seemed to go on forever with no end in sight. After the small stalls on either side, the faceless playing children, the demon-masked girls, all appeared a second time. Shen Qingqiu was finally certain. The street within the dream realm was looping. Going forward was fruitless. Since neither forwards nor backwards worked, he'd blaze a different trail. Shen Qingqiu looked left and right, then darted to the front of a liquor shop. Crimson lanterns hung high before the shop's doors. The red glow muted and beautiful, yet the wooden doors were tightly shut. Shen Qingqiu pulled onto the doors and walked inside when they immediately slammed closed by themselves. The inside of the house was dark. There was even a cold breeze blowing through. Rather than being inside a liquor shop, it felt closer to entering a cave. Shen Qingqiu didn't find this unexpected. Dream realms couldn't be reasoned with using common sense. Every door had the possibility to lead anywhere. At this moment, a series of eerie noises drifted by his ear. They sounded like the extremely labored, incessant panting of a person close to death, whose lungs had been punctured, who was in terrible agony. Moreover, it didn't seem like only one person. Shen Qingqiu snapped his fingers, flicking forth a flame from his fingertips, aiming at where the strange noises had come from. The flame illuminated the scene entirely without leaving out a single detail, and his pupils immediately shrank to pinpoints. Liu Qingge was holding Cheng Luan, the blade aimed at himself and stabbing it into his chest. Dun dun dun! Let's see, that was the end of chapter 40. Let's see how far we got to go. Alright, I think we're gonna call it there because my voice is a little hoarse and I have some stuff I need to do today. But, what a place to stop. But, we are almost caught up to the, translation of this story. I think chapter 52 is where it is currently. Yes. And, there are, I believe, 85 chapters in the book total. So, soon we'll be caught up. I mean, not that soon. Probably like a month. But, once we are, we'll just kind of wait and read like when every 2 chapters update, maybe. We'll see. I'll have to see how often the story updates. And we'll transfer to reading another story. Most likely, Modao Zushi, the story that inspired The Untamed, because that is the biggest story, as far as I can, one of the biggest, and is fully translated. So we will start reading that one after this one. It'll be a while before we finish the other story by the author that we've been reading, Mo Sheng Tongshu, Heaven Official's Blessing. She wrote all 3, Heaven Official's Blessing, Scum Villain, and Modao Zushi. Scum Villain was her first one, which I think is why it's the shorter of the 3. Thanks again for listening, and if you like what I do and you want to support it, please consider becoming a member. Those of you who are here today, like Daniel, Delvin, Kohi, Jeff, thank you so much for your support. There's an alternative. Ooh, I should check that one out. Thank you for the name. I knew there was another translation, but I didn't know who did it, so I'm gonna have to look that up. Thank you, all of the members, for your support. You help me to be able to do this and to support the continuation of it. If you'd like to do that, links in the description. I don't think I have any more notes. This is going to be a kind of chill week, because honestly, there's a lot going on, and I'm just going to be chill, you know? Anyway, thanks again, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!